This didn't start with panic. It started with confidence. On one quiet night in September 2008, a 158-year-old Wall Street giant didn't just fail, it vanished. Lehman Brothers collapsed so fast that even the people inside the building didn't fully understand what was happening. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This wasn't a surprise, it was a choice. If you think financial crises happen because of bad luck or market cycles, you're already falling for the cover story. Because when Lehman died, it didn't just kill a bank, it pulled the plug on the global financial system. And the most dangerous part? Nobody rang the alarm. Sunday night, September 14th, 2008. No sirens, no headlines yet, just silence, the dangerous kind. While most of the world was asleep, Wall Street was wide awake, staring at screens that suddenly didn't make sense anymore. Emails kept refreshing, phones kept buzzing, answers didn't come. Lehman Brothers was gone. Not struggling, not seeking a bailout, gone. Trillions of dollars instantly turned into question marks. Assets no one trusted, loans no one could price. Markets so fragile they didn't even crash, they froze, like a computer that just stopped responding. The scariest part? No one knew who was next. Bankers dissected balance sheets like crime scenes, politicians argued over who should blink first, and economists tried to explain what was happening, which somehow made everyone more nervous. Because this wasn't about one bank failing, this was the moment the financial system realized it might not survive the week. Within hours of Lehman's collapse, a story began spreading. Fast, clean, and reassuring. The kind of story systems tell when they need people to calm down. It sounded almost reasonable. The housing market went bad, risky mortgages blew up, Lehman was exposed, confidence vanished, the bank ran out of time. Simple, predictable, almost comforting. In this version of events, Lehman wasn't reckless, it was unlucky. A respected institution caught in a once-in-a-generation market storm no one could have predicted, let alone controlled. Executives, we're told, merely misjudged the risk. Regulators were caught off guard, and the financial system itself, still fundamentally sound, just shaken. It's a story that distributes blame without ever assigning intent. No villains, no decisions worth questioning, just numbers that moved the wrong way. But that framing hides something critical. Lehman didn't slowly drift into danger. It chose it. It chose leverage so extreme that even minor losses became fatal. It chose to sit on hundreds of billions of fragile, illiquid assets while publicly insisting everything was fine. And it chose to keep playing, even when the warning signs were no longer subtle, no longer deniable. This wasn't a sudden accident. This was a slow, deliberate walk toward a cliff, with everyone involved pretending the ground would somehow hold. This is where the story stops being an accident. The chaos that night wasn't caused by confusion. It was caused by certainty. Everyone in the room understood the consequence, and still no one pulled the brake. That silence, that's the real warning sign. What actually killed Lehman wasn't a lack of money, it was a decision. Lehman didn't collapse because help didn't exist. It collapsed because help was intentionally withheld. That weekend, the system wasn't asleep, it was in crisis mode. Emergency calls ran through the night. The Federal Reserve was involved, the Treasury was involved. Every major Wall Street bank knew Lehman was bleeding, and they also knew exactly what its death would unleash. Options were on the table. A forced merger, a temporary guarantee, a backstop just enough to buy time. Then politics walked into the room. After saving Bear Stearns months earlier, Washington didn't want another bailout headline. No more rescues, no more moral hazard. Someone had to be the example. Lehman drew the short straw. The mistake wasn't punishment. The mistake was believing Lehman stood alone. It didn't. Lehman was wired into everything. Derivatives, repo markets, money funds, global banks using Lehman paper as collateral like it was cash. This wasn't discipline. It was yanking a load-bearing pillar to prove the building had good architecture. Everyone in that room understood the danger. They just believed they could control the blast radius. That confidence survived for about one business day. When Lehman fell, the financial system did something strange. It stopped talking to itself. Banks didn't lend, funds didn't trust, money stopped moving. That's when the real damage began.
Once Lehman was gone, something far worse than fear took over. Trust disappeared. Banks stopped lending, not because they were greedy, but because they were blind. No one knew who was exposed, no one knew which balance sheet was real, and no one wanted to be the next name erased overnight. Money markets, the invisible plumbing of global finance, seized up. Institutions that survived on overnight lending suddenly couldn't borrow for a single day. Cash became something you hoarded, not something you shared. It was like discovering oxygen required trust, and trust had just evaporated. The chain reaction was brutal and immediate. Years of greed had pushed leverage higher and higher. Warnings were ignored because profits were loud and quarterly bonuses louder. Denial set in because admitting the truth meant ending the party, and no one wanted to be the one who turned off the music. Then came the explosion. Stock markets collapsed across continents. Companies froze hiring overnight. Trade slowed to a crawl. Pensions bled quietly in the background. Governments watched tax revenue vanish in real time while rescue plans were still being drafted. And here's the controversial part. Some insiders still argue this wasn't a crisis. They argue it was a controlled demolition, a moment where losses were allowed to spread because stopping them would have exposed just how fragile the system really was. A crisis looks accidental. This looked tolerated. This is the moment everything snapped into focus. Monday morning arrived and the markets didn't just fall, they locked up. Trading screens filled with red, then stopped updating altogether. Prices made no sense, liquidity vanished. It wasn't chaos, it was paralysis. This was when investors realized they weren't just losing money, they were trapped inside a system that could no longer move. Governments scrambled, emergency calls bounced across time zones, central banks prepared tools that hadn't been used in generations, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the world held its breath. Because if one more major institution failed, there might not be a market left to open the next day. Most people think Lehman's collapse was the end of the story. It wasn't. It was the moment the rules quietly changed. Lehman didn't just trigger a crisis, it rewired the financial system and decided who would carry the cost. And that cost, you're still paying it today. People think the 2008 crisis ended when markets stopped falling. It didn't. It just went quiet. After Lehman, the rules changed, not on paper, but in power. Central banks became the market. Interest rates were pushed to zero, then below it. Trillions of dollars were created to stabilize a system that could no longer stand on its own. On the surface, it worked. Banks survived, markets recovered, stock charts went up and to the right. But the damage didn't disappear. It was transferred. Savings earned nothing. Asset prices exploded. If you owned stocks or real estate, you got richer. If you lived on wages, you fell behind. Housing became unaffordable. Inequality hardened. Every future crisis now required a bigger rescue than the last. And here's the uncomfortable connection. Your rent, your grocery bill, your sense that money feels fake now. All of that traces back to the night Lehman was allowed to disappear. The crisis didn't just reshape finance, it reshaped what stability even means. The night Lehman Brothers died didn't feel historic. It felt procedural, a decision made in closed rooms, justified with calm voices, signed off like a routine operation. And that's the most dangerous part, because finance doesn't collapse in explosions, it collapses in meetings. Lehman didn't fail because the math was wrong. The math worked perfectly for people who expected to be rescued. Warnings were visible, risks were documented. Everyone knew the leverage was insane, but confidence is louder than caution. And denial is cheaper than responsibility. The system survived, yes, but only by rewriting the rules after the damage was done. What followed wasn't stability, it was dependence. Markets learned that risk would be socialized, institutions learned that size equals immunity, and everyone else learned, slowly, quietly, that the cost would show up in prices, wages, and opportunity. Not at all once, but forever. Because every time someone says, "This is just how the economy works now," they're still talking about the night Lehman was allowed to disappear.
If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more cool stuff they don't teach you at school.